This is Toby Harnden, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
And there's a plane flying right overhead, right when we start the show. Gotta love it. You gotta love recording in your backyard in a tent. Hey, man, I appreciate you coming on the show. You've written a bunch of incredible books. I know this is going to be a fun chat. I don't know if you know this about me, but I was a counterintelligence agent in the Army, and I've been to Afghanistan quite a bit. And so I think we can have a unique conversation based upon what you've learned and in general your books. Everybody should go check out Toby's website. It's real simple. It's his name, tobyharnden.com, for the books and everything else that he has. I'll put a link to the book up here in a second. His book is called First Casualty, The Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. So, okay, we just passed the anniversary of 9/11 last month, basically a month ago today. And that was 20 years. And though you have an accent like you're from somewhere else, you're an American citizen. Are you a citizen on 9/11 back when it happened in 01?
No, I wasn't. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, but I was a UK citizen. And in fact, I think 9/11 and everything surrounding it was one of the reasons why I then applied to become a US citizen. And I got a green card in 2006, and then I became a citizen in 2009.
Just out of curiosity, what did it mean to you to become an American? I mean, the UK is pretty sweet. It's pretty neat to be a citizen of that country and that coalition of countries. But what did it mean?
It meant quite a lot. I mean, freedom, opportunity. I really didn't like the sort of the class system in Britain, the sort of the elite, the aristocracy, and I felt that the sort of equality of opportunity and the sort of level playing field that everyone started off in the United States was something special, and we weren't sort of encumbered by the sort of weight of empire and hundreds of years of history, and sort of a young, forward-looking country. So yeah, I'm proud to be an American. I still am a British citizen as well.
Okay, good.
I didn't have to renounce it, but if I given the choice, I would renounce the UK side in a heartbeat.
Right. Don't let us know that. We don't like dual citizenship.
I guess in intelligence you can't do that. So if you had to have a top secret,
that's right,
caveated clearance, you'd have to renounce. Yeah.
Right. Or only get access to Five Eye intel, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
You've written a lot of books. Do you think you have a theme? Do you have a style of books that you write?
So I have thought about this recently, what the sort of a common denominator is, because the first one was about the IRA, sort of heartland of the IRA, border area in South Armagh, over a sort of 25-year period. Then the second book was about the British in Helmand, a battle group. So I guess a sort of battalion plus a lot, so like 1,500 people over course of mostly 6 months. And this was, at the core of it, 8 CIA officers in First Casualty over the course of, from 9/11 till the end of November 2001. So I think the common theme is sort of the reality of war, the messiness of war, the heroism, but also the cowardice, the achievement, but also the failure. And so I also think very much relating sort of granular detail and just the sort of minutiae of the stuff that happens on the ground to the overall picture. And I think in all 3 books, I sort of tried to do that, because, you can have a great story, but it's, it needs to sort of mean something, otherwise it's just sort of a firefight in a sort of vacuum. And
yeah,
so I think that's a sort of common theme.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I'm a ground truth guy. I mean, I went outside the wire all the time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I got to see us simultaneously get things right and wrong all the time. But then it gets even more granular than that, because one time I was going to go out on patrol. I went to my room to go grab my kit, and my door handle came off of my hand. And he's like, now what am I going to do? I got to go find, now I got to, in hyper fast time, I have to go find the guy that has a key that can open my broken door, because it wasn't like something simple. And then try to get that done in minutes. Got it done, but I was so blown by that whole experience, running all over the camp, trying to find the right guy. And if I say running, you don't really run in a combat zone. You walk quickly, because when you run, everybody's like, what's he running from?
Yeah.
But you're in a panic state. And then I go out, and it took me the whole patrol to kind of calm down, because I'm desperate to get on this patrol and do my job. And something dumb like a broken door couldn't stand in the, but sometimes that stuff does stand in your way. I mean, whether you're in Ireland or somewhere else, it can be the dumbest thing that does it. And then a great point about the firefight, because a firefight is probably one of the biggest moments in someone's life, especially a really nasty one. And it's inconsequential to everybody else in the world and probably to the greater problem that's trying to be solved, because one battle is not going to change the outcome of any of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's real life is crazy things happening, funny things happening, sad things happening, screw ups, you forget a particular bit of kit or whatever it is. And that's what real life is like. And so I think when you're writing sort of nonfiction, it can't just be like everyone's a hero, everything went to plan, because life just isn't like that. And that's not what reality is.
Never is, never is. I'm curious on how you look at the parallels between, I guess, what we would all call the successful de-escalation of the IRA English conflict. We're at worst, we're at like a mean mugging across the aisle from each other. There's not, constant conflict, constant bombs, constant tension like there was during the Troubles.
Yeah.
Is that outcome possible in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, or is it just totally different stuff?
I would tend towards it being totally different stuff, certainly in terms of magnitude. And so I know, actually, I remember Hank Crumpton talking about this. Hank Crumpton was the CIA senior CIA officer who sort of ran the war from CIA headquarters. So Cofer Black was the director of the Counterterrorism Center. Hank Crumpton was his deputy. And so Hank Crumpton was the one who was talking to Team Alpha, which is the team I write about in First Casualty, and all the other teams sort of daily. And he would get really annoyed with the Brits, sort of talking about Malaya and Northern Ireland and their sort of colonial experience. And I sort of sympathized with him because I used to hear it in Iraq as well. So the Brits sort of saying, oh, these kind of dumb Americans, wearing their helmets and chewing gum and wearing sunglasses, should put on berets and, go and talk to the local population. And I mean, that actually happened in I forget what they used to call it, the Triangle of Death around Mahmoudiya. Same in 2004 when I was in Fallujah with the Americans, and the Brits had to kind of backfill, and a lot of them got killed, in the first couple of days, and then the helmets came on. And so I feel that, I mean, it's interesting if you look at the troubles, so-called troubles in Northern Ireland. 25 years, it was kind of unresolved, really. I mean, there was this sort of deal at the end of it, and you can argue that the IRA won. You can argue that the IRA were defeated, but they were certainly heavily infiltrated. But if you look at everything you had going for you then in terms of the British side, you had the same language. You had a very small patch of land, albeit you did have a sort of sanctuary in the Irish Republic, a sanctuary of sorts, which obviously, we've had in, both the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. But you had members of the IRA who generally speaking didn't want to die. Right. And not only didn't want to die, they didn't want to get captured. So they would abort an operation, if it looked like they might get captured. There was too high a chance of getting captured, never mind getting killed. And you had all the sort of leverages you have in a kind of Western society about sick kids, education for your family, money, sort of marital tensions, all these kind of levers that you could kind of get people to flip and become informants. And there were many informants. But even given all that, it still was kind of a stalemate after 25 years. And so, I mean, this really kind of hit me in Helmand in 2009 when I wrote Dead Men Risen and covered the Welsh Guards down there. It's like the Brits, same as the Americans, you have no idea what the sort of tribal dynamics are, and the dynamics between the Afghan police and the Afghan National Army, and you're just going to be scratching the surface. They were there for, they were doing 6-month tours, and so I think the kind of, the comparison I would make is if with all the things going for you in the British case in Ireland, and 25 years ending up in stalemate, how can you possibly kind of quote solve something like Afghanistan?
Yeah, and would you say, just out of curiosity, would you say that the troubles, or what we're going to call that conflict, was
Yeah.
that was that sectarian, or was it just political? Because I mean, that's Iraq. I learned this a lot. I heard people all the time saying this. Like, this has nothing to do with Sunni Shia. That's just how we're divided. We don't care which form of religion. We're not religious. We're Iraqis. We like to drink alcohol, and they would pull out a bottle of whiskey and we drink it, right? So they're like, it's not sectarian violence. It's political violence. It's civil war. It's sorting out power structures, you know. And they're like, it's more like your blacks and your whites in your country. And I'm like, well, that makes a lot more sense. You know, you have people that are pushed back up against the wall. They're not fighting for an imam or like that at all. They were fighting for political power.
So it's definitely not. So okay, so the IRA are Catholics, and the loyalists, paramilitaries are Protestants, and the state historically was Protestant,
right?
But it's not about. So, you know, it's sectarian in that it's really about tribes. In Northern Ireland, it's really it's about tribes. So they don't care about, you know, the Virgin Mary and the Pope and, you know,
right.
Martin Luther and stuff like that. I mean, most people who are involved in paramilitary violence are not religious. And, you know, I mean, it's the same. A lot of people in Afghanistan, I mean, Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was the Uzbek warlord, who'd fought for the Soviets against the Americans in the 80s, but was an ally of Team Alpha, Team Alpha's and the Americans' sort of principal ally in the North in 2001. I mean, he drank and didn't, wasn't a good Muslim. I mean, he was nominally a Muslim. And in fact, there was one guy, one of his fighters, who the other fighters, he would pray several times a day, and the other Uzbek fighters would mock him, and in a kind of, it was sort of banter, joking really, but they'd call him the Taliban because he was so religious. So they weren't very religious, but obviously, tribal and ethnic. And I think it was like that in Northern Ireland. I mean, there were a small number of Protestants in the IRA, and there were Catholics who sort of worked with the state. I don't know whether there was ever a Catholic loyalist paramilitary, but I look at it as tribal. Basically, it was two tribes.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and definitely agree. The gap between Islam and whatever isn't Islam, Christianity, atheism, whatever it's going to be, it's enormous. And then actually, just I didn't bring it in with me. I just had a book was published with a piece of writing that I did with a couple of other authors, and we talked about the customary disregard for religion in conflict zones that we have, because we're afraid to go into a mosque. We don't understand it. We don't want to offend anybody, but really, if you embrace someone's religion in terms of being curious about it, not denigrating it, you can do a lot, and you can allow to be different. Like I would ask questions because part of my job is to understand the people, and they'd be like, "Hey, Pete, we understand you're not Islamic. It's fine. You're a Christian from we understand that." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Like, yeah, whoever told you to worry about these things, stop."
Yeah, I mean, on Team Alpha, it was interesting. This sort of did come up. So one of the team, Mark Rausenberger, who was the medic, and actually he died in the Philippines on CIA duty in 2016. He was Jewish, and he was sort of, he asked David Tyson, who was the guy who was in Kalajangi, the fort, who survived when Mike Spann was killed on November 25th. So David Tyson was an Uzbek linguist, sort of a polyglot who lived in Central Asia, and he'd been in and out of Afghanistan into the Panjshir from 99 to 2001 period. So he knew a lot about the Afghans. And so Mark spoke to David and said, should I tell him I'm Jewish? And, is it going to be a problem? And David was like, no, it's not a problem. Just say you believe in God, and and that's it. You don't need any more sort of detail than that. And that's what, and they all respected that. I mean, they weren't, as I said, particularly religious bunch. But what they wouldn't understand is atheism. Actually, that was one of the things that David said. But also, they don't want pandering. They don't want people going, "Oh, we respect your religion so much, and please, can you tell us?" It's like, that's just, it's pandering, and that doesn't work either. People can sort of sense that right away.
Yeah, they sure can, and they'd rather you know, again, they would say, Pete, you're not Islamic. And then they pull out the bottle of booze during Ramadan and we do shots, right? You're like, okay, so you're people first. Let them be people. That's a great point.
And one of the funny things with Team Alpha and alcohol is that actually David Tyson had one of the Uzbek commanders coming up to him, sort of knocking on the door of his cave or whatever he was sleeping in that night, and sort of said, you know, his hand was shaking. He said, you know, I need, and the translation was devil's water, and David was, and then he sort of twigged he wanted vodka, and so they actually got vodka sent in from Tashkent in the airdrops. And all these commanders were sort of surreptitiously coming to David and getting this little tot of sort of medicinal vodka. So, you know, they drank.
Well, and there's I call it a de-deifying each other, right? You know, we have this perception of like, these are the Americans, they're this. And if you're like, hey, I'm a human too, you know? And so when they offer you a drink, look, my job is to make friends. So I'm going to always say yes if they offer something. But in general, it allows you to see them as someone who's something other than what you imagine and takes them off a pedestal or whatever it is that you've got them on. And the same thing in the other direction. You know, you have to let them know like, hey, I got kids. I'd rather be home with them, but I'm here to do work. Are you here to work? Okay, I'm here to work. All right, let's work together. Yeah, we'll have a drink sometimes. Sometimes we're going to have hard conversations, whatever. But if you can de-deify a person and de-deify yourself, you're going to make a lot more progress and a lot faster.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that Team Alpha did, I mean, some of them were four of them were paramilitaries. You know, Mike Spann was one of those who were sort of, you know, elite sort of warriors. But two of them, David Tyson, who I mentioned, was a case officer, Uzbek linguist, and, you know, linguist of sort of many varieties. J.R. Seeger, who was the chief, he was a Dari linguist, and he worked with the Mujahideen out of Islamabad in the 1980s. And so they knew a lot culturally, and Team Alpha was very big on building a rapport with the Afghans and dealing with them as people, using sort of humor and sort of anecdotes, talking about their families and your families, because, you know, they were sort of living together and potentially dying together. So building that rapport is huge. Understanding what makes people tick. I mean, they didn't take in body armor or helmets because they didn't want to signal to the Afghans that our American lives are more important than your Afghan lives, right. You know, and they didn't bring in lots of high-tech weaponry either. They had the laser, the soft lambs to guide in the airstrikes, but apart from that, they carried they took in AK-47s. Part of that was so that they could share the same ammunition, because you don't want to be messing around with different ammunitions for rifles in sort of combat. But it was also like, you know, we're like you. We're here to fight like you. They didn't wear uniforms. You know, even the Green Berets, generally speaking, didn't wear uniforms.
Yeah, you want to be you want to be, you know, akin. You don't have to be the same, but you want to be same enough that you're recognizable. And I totally agree. You have to have your posture, as much as possible. Your posture must be like theirs. And when I remember this crazy patrol I was on, we leave the gate and we would do like our weapons checks, right? And there was this whole thing. It sounded like you were ordering food at a Waffle House, you know, like we're amber jamming, you know, weapons are red, blah, 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 this whole thing. And so we're doing this thing and we're wondering if we're a go on our mission because part of our equipment wasn't green. It wasn't good. Meanwhile, while this is going on, I look out the little tiny window of my bomb-proof vehicle and there's a mom and her daughter just walking down the road, just easy as you please, wearing regular old clothes. And so you're like, we're terrified to leave this camp. It's dangerous. But there's a mom and her daughter walking down the street right next to our patrol. So at some point we have to get better at balancing that, you know, that part of the scale, because we're as a nation, we're too terrified of that. But this is a different time. And I want to talk about your book specifically and get into this. I deployed right after 9/11. So 9/11 happens. I'm working selling computers. And when the second tower was hit, I stood up, walked over to my boss and said, I've got to go to my reserve unit. That's my place where I got to be. And he's just looking at me with his mouth open and nodding his head like, yeah, please go do whatever it is. And I lived in Chicago, so it could have been us that was next. It could have been one of our towers, you know?
Yeah. I think they evacuated the Sears Tower in Chicago was evacuated, wasn't it?
For sure. Yeah. And they were, luckily nobody was coming, but we didn't know that. I was sitting there and I was the first one to get to my unit because I happened to work really close to my unit. at my regular job, but I was keyed up. I was ready to go. And I'm a spy first, but it wasn't time for that. It was time for retribution. It was time for defense. It was time for, rounds to be fired and everything. And then I ended up deploying shortly after that. And I went to Egypt, but, of all places. And we didn't know if we were staying. Some of us did stay. I almost had to stay. And I would go out every day and go on these morale, recreation, welfare kind of, touristy kind of things. And we would go out to the pyramids and all these other things. It was wonderful. But part of my job was to see how the posture was. And I'm seeing it through this eyes of a guy whose country was just attacked. And so I'm looking around, trying to find out where the threat is. And I was able to kind of back that off because of what my job is and how I have to, work with things and the people I got to talk to. But it's hard and I actually applied to the CIA, and we were kind of dating for a minute, and we decided not to go down that road together. But there are a lot of people that were changing their lives and coming from this point of view of anger, hurt, harm, all these things because we had been attacked.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I see First Casualties very much a 9/11 book. I mean, 9/11 is in the subtitle, and the word "event," to the CIA, the untold story of the CIA mission to avenge 9/11. So, avenge is in the subtitle, and there was some sort of debate about that. Actually, Shannon Spann, Mike Spann's widow, she sort of questioned it, and she was like, "Well, wasn't the mission to deny sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, to go after the people who did 9/11, stop future attacks?" And it absolutely was, and certainly that's part of it. But I think vengeance was certainly part of Mike Spann's psyche and every person on that team. And I think it was sort of important to sort of capture that. Plus, denying sanctuary to Al-Qaeda is kind of long-winded for a subtitle, but I think it was important to sort of capture that. And I mean, I remember it vividly. I was in downtown DC, so I was reporting on 9/11. It was sort of the biggest work day of my life. We also had Flight 93 flying around. We believe now destined for the Capitol, possibly the White House. But my office was just a few blocks away from the White House, and I remember thinking like, wow, maybe it's just going to miss and land on this building. And then I can't think about that now. That night, in DC, there were Humvees on the corners of the streets. And so, yeah, I remember it vividly. And I mean, I deliberately opened the book with 9/11. And so Mike Spann was in CIA headquarters, and he was told to evacuate, and he was pissed. He was like, "We're the CIA. We do things. We don't go home." And he was like fuming. And David Tyson was on a plane. David Tyson's interesting because he was flying from Tashkent to London for a meeting at the CIA station there about recovering stingers from the 1980s. And he was actually the least affected by 9/11 because he wasn't in the United States on 9/11. And so while some of the team members were sort of extremely sort of keyed up about physically going into Afghanistan, pretty unsurprisingly, given what happened on 9/11, and you're on a Black Hawk helicopter, flying, from Uzbekistan, just kind of a little bit of Tajikistan airspace, and then into Afghanistan, a big deal. But for David, he'd been going in and out of Afghanistan for the previous 2 years. He'd been going into Tajikistan a lot, and for him, he had this sort of sense like it's just another trip. And so his kind of sense of danger and stuff actually was lower than some of the others. And it's possible that even fed into what happened on November the 25th, 2001, because everybody kind of has their tolerance. But I mean, I want people, as a part of the book, to remember or learn, if they were weren't old enough to be around and sort of paying attention then, of what 9/11 was like, what it was, the unity of the country. I mean, there was one member of Congress who voted against authorizing military force. Bush's popularity rating was 90%. I mean,
that's right.
Everybody was behind this. And I mean, you look at the divisions now, it was a very, very, very different time.
It was the last time our president had something well in excess of 70% approval.
Yeah.
You know, it was definitely a different time. I know I was desperate to get into the fight, and I was trying. That's why I applied to the CIA. I knew they'd be hiring. I wouldn't have been a candidate 2 weeks before because I was an Army counterintelligence. They typically don't hire us there, but they were short on people, and this was a good way for me to get into the fight. I got in a different way, but and then if I go to the 9/11 museum in New York City, boy, I get pissed.
Yeah,
I want to wind the clock back. I swear to God, this is true. I want to wind the clock back and have another go at it.
yeah,
And I know better, but that's the emotional response that I get from
yeah.
the whole fight.
Absolutely. So about a month or so ago, for the first time in many years, actually, I went to the site of Ground Zero. So I went to the Freedom Tower, One World Trade Center, which I'd never been to before,
Mhm.
and there's the America's Response Monument, which is a horse soldier, a
Yep.
Green Beret on a horse. There, never seen that before. That was great to see. And there was an event. It was the Third Option Foundation, which is a charity for CIA paramilitaries, a great organization. And it was sort of a fundraiser, and it was packed full of CIA officers, some serving. The head of Ground Branch was there. The head of the Special Activities Center was there. And retired case officers, retired paramilitaries, and friends. General Mulholland was there, who was the Task Force Dagger commander in 2001. But some of the speech, and there was members of New York Fire Department there, and it was visceral. And one of the paramilitaries still serving was their very senior guy. He was like, he said, we are the people who bear a grudge. We still bear a grudge. And it really took me back. It sent kind of a shiver down my spine to be on the site of that sort of mass murder that triggered all this. And these were the guys who were going after Al-Qaeda 20 years ago and are still going after them. And obviously, you had all the recent events of Afghanistan, and they've been getting Afghan allies out. So yeah, it really took me back to that sort of feeling of this sort of visceral, we need to go get them. We need to do something about this. And Mike Spann, for instance, his first battle was to get on the team.
Right.
He had a 6-month, in fact, less than that, a 3-month-old baby on 9/11. He was newly married. He had 2 daughters. He had a very complicated situation with his first wife was terminally ill. He had every reason in the world not to go. And he was like, no question about it, I'm going. And not only am I going, but I need to fight to go. I need to fight to get on the team. I want to be in there. And that was the story of all of them. Their biggest fear at the beginning was being bumped off the team because of somebody else and sort of missing out. So yeah, I remember it well.
I definitely identify with that because part of the reason why the CIA and I broke up was I just didn't. I would have to go as clandestine service. That was the only way I would be able to do it. That's what I'm good at doing. And my daughter wasn't very old. She was 4, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I just don't want to miss this. And so I'm going to find a different one. It turned out I was gone a lot anyhow, but it was a lot more on my terms, and I was able to work through that. But you're right. It's the timing of life, and then who's actually available to be there, who's in the network to be able to go there. And you're desperate. I'd be, if I was in the CIA sphere, then I would have been desperate to go on that team too. And I'd be a good asset. But there's a lot of people that are probably have better timing and better access to those jobs. And so if you're on the team, you would do everything you could to stay on it for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you get into the story, obviously it's about the first casualty in the title, that's Mike Spann, but it's not about him. This is a whole bunch of things. What else really grabbed you? Like what drew a lot of your attention besides just the unfortunate demise of Mr. Spann?
Yeah. So Mike Spann is certainly, front and center in many ways. But again, talking to Shannon Spann, his widow, she and the rest of the team as well. But she was, I don't want this to be about Mike. I want it to be about Team Alpha. And that is what it's about. So it's about these 8 guys who were the first behind enemy lines. So there was Jawbreaker was in the Panjshir Valley on September 26th. So 15 days after 9/11. but that was Northern Alliance controlled territory, and the Fahim Khan, the sort of warlord, they were with Ahmad Shah Massoud's successor. Massoud had been assassinated on September the 9th. He didn't want to move, he didn't want to fight, and so they were kind of static. Whereas Team Alpha, they were, in Taliban-controlled territory, to denied territory, and they were linking up with Abdul Rashid Dostum, Uzbek warlord, and also Atta Mohammed Noor, who was the Tajik, who was a sort of rival and ally in that Afghan way of Dostum. So they linked up with those in the mountains and south of Mazar-e Sharif. And so they got there October 17th, 2001, and Mazar-e Sharif fell November the 10th. So it happened very quickly. But the thing that really grabbed me was how, first of all, how varied the team was, that it wasn't all paramilitary officers, it was case officers and a medic. There was a Green Beret, Justin Sapp, who's a colonel still serving. So very sort of different characters and ranging in sort of age. The oldest, Alex Hernandez, who was the deputy, who was had a legendary special forces career before joining the agency. He was 49. Justin Sapp was 29. So really sort of different characters bring lots of different things to the party. I mean, David Tyson was a former academic, who's, he was an expert on Turkmen shrine pilgrimages, really interesting guys. And in a way, he fits the sort of, that classic CIA thing, you want a PhD who can win a bar fight, and so people like that. Really, really interesting people.
Yeah.
And David Tyson ended up killing about 40 Al-Qaeda, as well as his, linguistic ability and his, expert in sort of Central Asian culture. When it mattered, he could step up and did. But what really struck me is, we now know what happened. We know that the Taliban, was toppled pretty quickly, and it was a successful mission. But at the time, they were flying into the unknown. They had no idea. I mean, Dostum may have turned around and he fought, with the Soviets. He could turn around and shot the Americans, or there could have been a dispute between Atta and Dostum, which was certainly sort of on the cards at times. So to me, it was sort of going into the unknown and how adaptable they had to be, how everything was sort of improvised, and also the incredible kind of delegation of power, decision making that they had. So Kofa Black briefed Bush on this, and Hank Crumpton sort of ran the war, and he was talking to the team, the team leaders and deputies sort of every day. But they had an incredible latitude to make decisions. The team got split up, and Team Alpha was 8. It got split up, so 3 of them, Mike Spann and Justin Sapp and Mark Rassenberger, went off to Bamiyan, to meet with the Hazaras. David Tyson, Scott Spellmeyer, and Andy, who's actually the only one who's still serving, they went off to Sorab near Akupruk, where they linked up with Atta, and then another a 3-man CIA team called Team Bravo came in. CIA team Delta came into Bamiyan. So there's all this stuff happening. It was very, very complex. And also the other thing, which I can't sort of stress enough, is the incredible risk they were taking every single day. And so, what I mean, one of the things that kind of pisses me off a bit is the narrative that you get sometimes, like about November the 25th. So November the 25th, Kalajangi prison uprising. There's 400 Al-Qaeda prisoners being interrogated by just 2 Americans, Mike Spann and David Tyson, and then the Northern Alliance Guard Force as well, which on paper maybe echoes of today should have been enough, but they mostly ran or were killed very quickly. But, there's a sort of a lazy sort of narrative which kind of was, promulgated at the time, which was like, oh, what were they thinking? They were so stupid. They went in alone. They didn't have, Green Berets with them. And it's just every single day they took risk. They had to rely on Afghan allies, because there were only 8 of them, and they were with hundreds, if not thousands of Afghans. It was not no day was a perfect situation. Should they have gone to Bamiyan with just 3 of them and 5 Afghans? I mean, no. I mean, should they have worn body armor and helmets? Well, yes, but these were not perfect conditions. They were sort of leaning forward. There was an imperative to get in there. We couldn't just wait, 2 days. Oh, let's interrogate Al-Qaeda in 48 hours later, and let's bring in a guard force. It just sort of wasn't like that. And so, that was that sort of tolerance for risk, and the number of things. So, it went pretty badly wrong on November 25th. It could have gone wrong in a pretty bad way almost every single day they were there.
This is 100% true. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because I've spent time in conflict zones just like this. When I deployed to Bosnia, there were 2 vehicles, 2 Humvees, soft-sided, and there was no radio in my vehicle. Right. So that's just what it is. Like, you go with what you got, and that's what we had. We never had a radio in the vehicle. And there are 4 of us. One of us is an interrogator. She's got a 9mm. The boss of the team, the NCO, has a 9mm. I've got a M16, and my partner has an M16. And we had an interpreter who was a Navy guy, right? And God bless, like that's fine, but he's not a ground warrior. He's there to talk, right? And so he had, I think, a pistol, maybe he had a rifle. That's it. We get in any kind of a gunfight, we're going to die. We didn't get into a gunfight, but that was not within our control, other than to, use the gift of gab, make friends, be likable, be someone that nobody wanted to kill. But if someone had decided to attack us, it would have just been a massacre. And also, we had to decide, like, what was our response posture going to be? You can't just go in and annihilate 100 people, because then you become the butcher of Baghdad or wherever you're at, and you have this other problem. So how do you have a controlled response to something that's completely out of control every single day? And when November 25th happens, or when the ODA that got run down on the Mali and Niger border, right?
Yeah.
It was a horrible situation and all of these things, but there was no good situation. There is no way to prepare for this, because it could be November 23rd. It could be October 2nd. Any day can be that day where something accidental happens, something purposeful happens. That's war. It just doesn't allow for, you're welcome to look at it and think, oh, they should have done this or should have done that. But the reality is you don't know what you're supposed to do, because you're literally making it up every day.
Yeah. And I think particularly in this 9/11 period, I mean, when you're at war for sort of 20 years, you learn a lot. But this was the first rodeo for a lot of these guys, and it's the first time they were doing any of this. So when people say, I've heard people say even recently, like, oh, they weren't following any of the procedures. Well, there were no procedures. Interviewing procedures for interviewing Al-Qaeda, 400 Al-Qaeda in a fort in Afghanistan. I mean, there's no sort of manual for that. And
there's enough people to run that operation with what you've described. That's just not enough people. It's never going to be enough people. Here's your task: go interview these people. You just do it.
Right. And you certainly, I mean, certainly there were after action reports and lessons learned from that, and
Sure.
but when you look at that, when I look at that day, I mean, it was, and I did in very great detail, and it's sort of, I don't know, like 3 or 4 chapters of the book are probably on that day. But it's sort of like painful now, because you can see, I know what's happening, and and you can sort of see it unfolding. And it's like any of these, when things go wrong, it's this combination of maybe, I don't know, a dozen different things. You change any one of them, and it could have all been different. But then, of course, there would have been other days when there were 12 things that could have led to an absolute disaster, and one thing did change, so it didn't happen. And then you never knew about it, and you never thought about it, and you just, it was like the sort of the bullet that instead of hitting your head, it was 6 inches the other way, and you just, you think about it for a moment, and then you just get on with, what you're doing. So that's the way combat and operations are,
And you could drive yourself crazy thinking about all the scenarios and everything else. You do need to have a plan F and a plan F2 and a plan K and all of these things, and be ready. You think through all these things, but ultimately you go out, you do your job, and then you go out. And you don't want to be predictable, but you also want to do what works. So you do become predictable in some form or fashion. And just because you got helmets on, just because you have a lot of ammo, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to do my job well. I do my job best when I've created enough trust where I don't need the army with me, and I can walk off the camp and be under the protection of an Afghan elder, leader, political member, whatever it is, that's when I can get the most stuff, because now I'm relying on them within their culture to keep me safe. If I got caught and tortured and everything else, whatever, I killed, it'd be a tragic, and I'd be stupid for going off the camp without my gear. However, I got stuff that no one else could get because I knew how to do that. And I didn't take the risk lightly. And I had the advantage of years of knowledge in these areas when I did this stuff. These guys had to invent it. And I can't imagine the authority that they were granted. And then who was the first, would you say was the first cuttable neck? We're like, hey, they shouldn't have done that. It's going to be your fault. Because it's almost always at the bottom. It's always like, they never like, hey, Colonel, hey, GG-15, CIA operator. It's always like some guy on the ground, like, you happen to make the wrong call here,
Well, I mean, I think in this case, actually, there was a remarkable lack of second guessing what happened within the CIA. I mean, they Mike Spann and David Tyson had spoken to Hank Crumpton the night before. I mean, this was the first time Americans had got face to face with Al-Qaeda fighters, since 9/11. And one of them was John Walker Lind. And okay, so John Walker Lind, Californian, the so-called American Taliban. I mean, in fact, he was Al-Qaeda, but he was no terrorist mastermind, but he'd met bin Laden. He trained at the Al Farouk camp, as a number of them had. I mean, these were not, they didn't know who was among them, but there were a lot of them had trained at in Al Qaeda camps, and some of them were commanders, particularly some of the Uzbeks, and they didn't know, and what they didn't, they were concerned about their own security, but that was not the top of their list. I mean, of priorities. They wanted to get things done, and they wanted to get intelligence on Al-Qaeda. They wanted to find out who had, done 9/11 and stop the next attack. And they, and so they trusted in their Afghan allies, as they had every day in the previous sort of 40 days, to provide security for them. Afghan allies aren't always reliable, and it didn't work that day. But that was just kind of the nature of what they were doing, I think.
Did you get a chance to talk to Mike's ex-wife as well, or no?
Yeah. His ex-wife. No. His ex-wife. I mean, absolute tragedy. I mean, she died weeks later. So she died of she had ovarian cancer, and she died, I think, at the end of 2001. And in fact, around the time Mike died on November 25th, she was, I think, I spoke, Mike's mother told me that that Sissy, which was what the family called Mike's first wife, Catherine, she registered that Mike had been killed, but that was about it. She was just sort of slipping into that period of terminal cancer. So unbelievable, and obviously that meant that you had two young girls who were all of a sudden orphans. I mean, really, really, really sad.
Yeah, I mean, you think about that was not in the plan on August the 1st, 2001. This wasn't going to be the outcome, and months later, those two kids have no parents.
I know. I mean, it's just, and then of course, people have sort of different phases in their lives. Sometimes things are stable. Sometimes, divorces happen. More rarely, thankfully, things like serious illness happens. But one of the tragedies with Mike and the family is that 2001 year. I mean, his son Jake had been born in June, and actually Mike had been away on TDY in the Balkans from sort of July to September, so he barely spent any time with his son. His first wife was terminally ill, and so there's all these kind of things in flux. A new wife with his family in Alabama, things that would have been resolved, or kind of, a stable kind of dynamic would have been established over the years, and the person that would have done that would have been Mike, because obviously he would have been the sort of the glue that held it all together. And I talked to sort of Shannon and Mike's parents about it, but Mike's ripped out of it, and then all these things that would have kind of been smoothed out, you know, are all extremely raw. And so that's, you know, that's the tragedy of sort of death. But I feel Mike's death was particularly sort of poignant because, I mean, he was the only person on the team. I guess if you sort of done a list of things, personal things you're going through, he would have been the one who you would have said like, wow, that's a lot to deal with, Mike, you know?
Yeah. And you think about the fact that since mom survives him, there's legal problems, you know, and could be family. And I don't know what the outcome is. I don't know if you want to get into that, but it could be that, you know, her family wants those 2 kids, and it could be that Shannon's like, no, I got to raise them. But all that stuff is extra strife because
yeah, I mean, you know, that's what life is like. And yes, I mean, it was an issue, you know. I mean, the you know, Mike's parents, there was a custody battle between Mike's parents and Shannon, and that's, you know,
in the middle of grief. Oh, you know, just
everybody's acting. I think, you know, you've got to assume that everybody's acting from the best motives, and they, you know, believe that what they're doing is right. But yeah, it's extremely painful. And, you know, another thing sort of I learned about this was, and I sort of knew anyway, in particular from Dead Men Risen, because I you know, there were number of Welsh Guardsmen who were killed, and you know, you have, you know, conflict between parents and spouses, obviously between spouses and ex-spouses, and all the dynamics. And one of the things that came through is how different people grieve. And in fact, there was a fantastic piece in the Atlantic about a young man who died centered on the young man who died on 9/11, and how the father became a sort of a 9/11 truther, you know. And there was a phrase in there that I thought was very apt, that the father treated his son's death like an unsolved crime, and it became his life's mission to work out what happened. Whereas, you know, the mother was just, I just want to celebrate his life, you know. And he also had a fiance or a girlfriend who was about to be a fiance, and they all had very, very different approaches. And, you know, and that's a cost of war. It's a cost of death. And it's sort of not to be underestimated. And I mean, I think it's important to recognize that people grieve in different ways, and to give people sort of the time and the space to sort of to do that, and the understanding to know that, you know, it's not the same for everyone.
And when you get older and you've seen enough death, a couple things come to light. One, nobody's good at people dying. You know, it's just hard, and everybody makes mistakes in their grief process and takes it out on somebody else. And then it's embarrassing and hard and everything else. So you have to give people an allowance to just be an absolute asshole sometimes, because there's time later on to make up for that. But it's going to happen, and it's not going to change the situation. Mike's still going to be dead. His ex-wife's still going to be dead. Where did the kids from his first marriage, where did they end up ultimately?
So Mike had designated Shannon as the guardian of his daughters, and so Shannon sort of prevailed in court, and she won. I mean, there's many winners in these things, custody, and I'm sure we wouldn't sort of see it that way. But anyway, so Jake and the girls moved to Australia with Shannon, where she was stationed as sea officer in Canberra. They then returned. Shannon remarried a CIA case officer that she'd met in Australia, and at that point, the girls went to Alabama to live with the grandparents, and went to high school in Winfield, Alabama, Mike's high school, because I think, you know, part of their growing up had been spending time with their grandparents, and they identified Winfield with their father. And so I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I think it was sort of by agreement. I think it was difficult. And now the kids are all grown up, and one of the, with all these things, you know, there's stuff I knew about all this that I didn't sort of write, because it's sort of not necessary, and you want to give a sense of it without getting into the weeds of, you know, custody and divorce and all that, which is pretty painful, and, you know, you don't need to know stuff. But Shannon said, you know, and she's open about how difficult it's been. She now suffers from rheumatoid arthritis, and she sort of feels that she sort of pushed a lot of this stuff down and just soldiered on, kind of thing. But she said, this was talking to her last year, sort of the middle of last year, and she said, we're all going to, 3 kids. She's got another child with her current husband, and so all, so they're ranging from, I don't know, late 20s to about sort of 9 or 10. And she said all the kids are going to be around the table at Christmas, and and we're going to be eating together. And that's, so despite all our sort of brokenness and the sort of the difficulties and the the things that are no doubt ongoing, we're all going to be around the same table, and that's something. And I think that is something,
It is. Yeah. It's one of the things I wanted to ask about, because we often don't think about the other half of that family equation, and someone like Shannon, who now has to, again, like, November 22nd, she's got a husband. They're going to probably have another kid, and, they have plans. And then all of a sudden she's in this giant shitstorm while she's a professional CIA employee. What about, what is her thought on, you can't wind the clock back, but if she did, could she, because you could for sure get Mike off of that team. Would she have pushed harder, or would she let him, even if she knew that he was going to die? Was this how it had to play out?
I've never asked her that question sort of directly in that way.
Yeah.
But I think I know the answer. And actually, next time I see her, I will ask her.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure I know her answer. Because she did say to me that she briefly considered whether to say to Mike, would this be a good idea? And she's a new mother. She's on maternity leave at the time, and so. But I think it was very brief, because she knew that it was just, it was in the fiber of Mike Spann's being. This is what he joined the CIA to do. It's also what she joined the CIA to do. So in a way, as a spouse, I think she was ideally sort of positioned to understand, what being in the CIA was, and being at the sort of the forefront of America's response was. And she also knew, and Mike had sort of made clear that he didn't see, and this, his daughter Alison was 9, and he had conversations with his daughter about this, that he didn't differentiate sort of service to country and service to family. So you could say, it could be one or the other, but he saw it as, well, if I don't go, somebody else's daddy's going to have to go. Somebody has to do it. I'm positioned, I've got the skills. Send me, and I'm protecting my family by doing it, because I'm protecting every family in America. So I don't think anything Shannon could have said would have made a difference to Mike going, and I don't think she would have wanted it, because she understands sort of what happened better than most people, because she's was a CIA officer herself. She understood the risks they were taking. She understood that Mike wanted to do it. That's why he joined the CIA, and it was sort of part of him. And so, she certainly talks about how her life was just sort of turned upside down by this. But my sense is, she's kind of quite a sort of spiritual, very thoughtful person. And she believes in a higher being, and so I don't think she would have, even in hindsight, tried to interfere with sort of Mike's decision and what happened.
Who else stood out in this story as being, look, they're all remarkable, they're all exceptional. I don't want to say anybody else didn't do it, but somebody else must have really grabbed your attention, and you said, man, there's just more story here than I've got booked to put it in.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, David Tyson. So, he, I sort of described a bit his background. He was, at the time, he was 40 years old, which put him in the mid-range of the age on the team. But he was kind of an outlier, because he was in some ways, he was the least acclimatized to the US, and the sort of the 9/11 sort of psyche. he was at the end of his first tour in the CIA, but he was based in Tashkent, and he just signed up for another one, which in terms of career development was not sort of a good idea. So he was much more sort of rooted in the region than anybody else, and he'd lived in Uzbekistan as a student. At one point he possessed no shoes. He really was close to going native.
Yeah.
And he'd been an academic at Indiana University. He was pursuing a PhD, and then he made this decision to turn his life around and become a spy, an intelligence agent. And he was a great case officer, became a great case officer, and ended up working a lot on Russian issues. He had a military background, but he'd been in artillery, enlisted artillery guy after school. He'd been an intelligence officer in the ROTC, but it was pretty limited military experience back in the 80s. And so to me, it was fascinating and just almost something you couldn't make up, because of the 8 people on the team, he would be the last person you would have picked to be in the position that he was in when Mike Spann was killed, and he had to fight his way out, in this fort where he had these jihadis sort of literally almost flinging themselves on him, trying to kill him, and yet he was able to do it. He kind of, his sort of psychological state was sort of transported into another realm, and he experienced all the sort of time slowing down, tunnel vision, all those classic sort of responses. But he is just an incredibly thoughtful person. I mean, he spent the last 20 years processing what happened that day. Thinks about it all the time, and is always grasping for the sort of the bits of the tape that have disappeared and probably been erased from the hard drive, which is how a therapist, psychologist sort of described it to him. But he was, he really, really knew the Afghans, and so that gives another sort of dimension to him. But his sort of willingness and ability to sort of dive down into his own psyche and talk about how it's affected him, the thought process of what he was going through, his sort of really deep relationship with the Afghans. I mean, he would often sort of stop me and sort of say, Mike was killed that day, but so was Amanullah. I mean, like, Amanullah was an Afghan intelligence officer that David had sort of got close to within days in the mountains, and he still got a little penknife that Amanullah gave him that Amanullah had bought from a bazaar south of Mazar-e Sharif, which I think was fashioned from bits of weaponry. So he had this sort of deep bond with Afghans, and also went on to have another 20 years in the CIA almost, and so believes, I guess, in a way that sort of the CIA and the meaningfulness of that job helped sort of, I wouldn't say save him, but keep him sort of sane and sort of leading a productive sort of life those last 20 years. So putting all that together, it's very rare to come across somebody that's prepared to just open themselves up. And it took a bit of time, but ultimately there's nothing David wouldn't answer. There's nothing, oh, that's an interesting question, I'll think about that. Sometimes he wouldn't fully answer one time, and then the next time I see him, I'd say, you didn't really answer that. He's like, yeah, I didn't really answer that. So I've been thinking, and so that was sort of fascinating, and other characters as well. But I certainly think that David sort of, because of what he went through, sort of stands out.
No, I appreciate that answer, and it's funny, those he and Spann are both former artillery guys. And then turn around and come into the CIA. It's interesting. It's also funny when you say, he got so deep into the Uzbek world. I'm a big believer in this. Like, if you're going to do spy work, like, I would have benefited tremendously from getting out of Germany, out of the US, and going somewhere and just living there. Not like a tourist, but like, what is it like to be like these people? And it's funny that that's bad for your career to go. But it's funny that that's bad for your career, because if you can develop that kind of cultural capacity to go anywhere, to understand the people. You can operate anywhere. You can operate with any interpreter. You can really learn how to do it. It's not about going to Paris and seeing the sights. It's about going to, some other place that's a little harder to survive in and seeing what it's like. And it's okay not to wear shoes, but that terrifies higher up people who are like, but it's comfortable here in DC.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So another thing I found out about this and I sort of had a sense of, but I really got a kind of deep sort of understanding of, is the CIA is full of tribes as well. Africa Division, Kofa Black was from Africa Division. So was Hank Crumpton. So was Rich Blee, who was the head of Alex Station, who was another important person in CTC at the time. And Africa, is very different from Near East Division, who sort of are more of the sort of cultured sort of elites, the fast track guys who look down on the sort of, the rogues and rebels in Africa Division. And then, of course, you got the operators and the analysts. And then you've got the paramilitaries and the case officers and there's a lot of ex-Marines. So the ex-Marines in the paramilitary world compared with the ex-soldiers, and then the SEALs, and Delta doesn't really like the paramilitary. All these different kind of things. And but also obviously sort of great sort of commonality between them. And another thing I sort of found fascinating about David, and I think other CIA officers as well, is he's a very sort of proud and patriotic American. He doesn't sort of wear it on his sleeve, but it's absolutely there. But he loves people. He's really interested in people, and so he can communicate. Like, he's interrogated, not the enhanced interrogation, but he's sort of debriefed Al-Qaeda. I mean, obviously, he did it on November the 25th, but he's done it, at much sort of greater length subsequently. He's interrogated Al-Qaeda suspects, and he can hate them and hate what they do, and certainly the death and destruction they want to sort of rain down on America, but still be intensely interested in them. Sort of share a joke with them, appreciate their humor, care about them and their families in a way, and those things can happen simultaneously, and I think that's probably one of the things that makes a great intelligence operator.
You're 100% right. You have to identify that their reality is different than yours. You don't have to accept it or approve of it. Or you have to accept it, but you don't have to approve of it. And that includes things that we find heinous and horrible. I mean, to include raping boys. You have to say, like, this is a reality here, and there is nothing I can safely do about this, and you can hate it and you put it off to the side. I've talked to some very evil, murderous people that have done horrible things, and my job is to get beyond that and to get them to tell me things they wouldn't tell anybody else. And you carry a lot of things. I have my book of woe. It's in back of my head, and I hear all of these horrible stories of families being destroyed and all these other things. But that's all tertiary or beyond that in terms of I've got a job to do. And you're right. If I do my job well, hopefully nobody else has to come here and do it. Hopefully my kid is safe and I'm helping to fix a problem. Hey, what are you working on next?
So I have a couple of ideas. Can't sort of, don't want to sort of jinx it.
Okay.
But I've, it's funny. So I've been a sort of full-time journalist for 25 years. And, the 3 books I've written, I'm very proud of them. But, there's a 10-year gap between them. And that's not a very good hit rate. So I want to sort of up the hit rate and get on with something else. Plus, this is in a way the first time where I've done an American book. The first 2 were sort of much more British or Irish, and so I want to sort of capitalize on the sort of momentum of this book and tell more stories like it. I mean, in a way, what I want to do with a book is enable. Obviously, you want to write a great book that's going to touch people's lives and be part of history and all the rest of it. But in the short-term practical sense, I just want it to lead to another book, so I can do, so I don't have to go and work at McDonald's or whatever to pay the bills. I can sort of but I'm looking at something that that has elements of the CIA, elements of special forces, and Vietnam involved in it as well. So there's some clues, but who knows? There are other things, bubbling as well.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. I want you to come back anytime you have a project to talk about. I may even hit you up to come in and co-host with me when we have the right kind of guest, because
Oh, sure. Yeah.
you get it in a lot of ways. A lot of people can't. And just the fact that you understand the danger you go through as being a spy on the ground, and just like everything can be against you in a moment, but you have to work past that. And the fact that you get that alone is good for me, man. I love it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And yeah, happy to be on anytime.
All right, stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the